Morning. It's a great pleasure indeed to be here because in the sector that I'm in, we hear day in and day out about how technology and how digital is transforming every single segment of our existence, every aspect of our life. And it's now fashionable to call this the Uberization of every sector, although Uber is not necessarily a very apt phrase nowadays, but I think that was well put. And in the area of retail, I think it has been in many ways even more dramatic. And it's dramatic in two different ways actually. One very visible story in India in the last few years has been the emergence of e-commerce. And the other, of course, is how brick-and-mortar retail is being impacted by technology. And a surprising fact that I came across was that even in developed countries, e-commerce still accounts for only a single-digit percentage of all the retail trade. So there is a very interesting and a curious equilibrium which is reached between these different modes of dealing with the consumer. But let's look at what consumer centricity, which is the essence of retail, means in a digital world. And what are the forces which are propelling it, and what in particular are the changes within the country that are happening, which are impacting this area and which are probably likely to impact it even more? And how does digital become a key differentiator in this space? So, 4 rapid disruptions that are redefining the global retail industry. First of all, the demographic shifts, and we just heard Mr. Nagesh talking about the very different behavior of people in different age groups. But today, as the mobile revolution has swept India, the younger generation are almost speaking a different language. This is true even within IT companies, so outside of them it would be equally so, and perhaps even more so. And in India, we have recently crossed last year, at the end of last year, more people accessing the internet through mobile than through the conventional computer mode. So in India, unlike in, say, a developed country, more people are accessing the internet through mobile, and therefore the way in which they get their information, how they ascertain, check facts, and how they communicate is also heavily mobile centric. And as we see a higher and higher penetration of smartphones, and now with the advent of 3G and 4G and broadband, those changes are set to become even more intense and accelerate far beyond what we are already seeing. And again, the proliferation of social networks is a demonstrator of how, while the technologies are the same all across the world, but the manner in which they are impacting societies is very different. It depends on many, many factors, and how it impacts each segment also does vary. So it would be a mistake to really just pick up an example from some other country and say, this is what is going to happen. It's not going to happen that same way. And therefore, if you look at how the social networks have impacted in the developing world today, they are very much a part of the daily fabric of shopping. Not necessarily so in the developed world. In fact, there the use of social networks is more for communicating. So there are big behavioral differences also, which are quite deeply rooted in the society, in the manner in which the culture and the society and the economic levels and the infrastructure and the services are laid out in that economy. and the evolving role of the store. So that is something which again is getting impacted, with premium in the future being something, ways of creating a unique and brand defining offer. So the definition of premium itself would be undergoing changes in this context. If you look at how the digital world is creating and empowering consumers and what impact that has, just look at some of these numbers. There are 6.8 billion mobile subscribers, which is now equal to the world's population. Pretty much as it is in India, where we've just hit the billion mark in terms of subscribers. And 2.7 billion people are online. And in India, out of this 1 billion people who are 1 billion mobile subscribers, we have more than 250 million who are online and access the internet. And mobile broadband subscription has jumped to 2.1 billion. In India, we are still at a fairly low level in terms of broadband penetration, somewhere between 20-25 million, which is still a very long way to go. But as you would be seeing from the newspapers, the war in the telecom sector has changed and is likely to impact this hugely. And more than 1 billion people using social networks. And India is actually the second largest user, for example, on Facebook, and will soon become the largest as well. So that's the extent of the impact. Now, all of these translate into something, whether it is in terms of the product design, how the feedback takes place and how quickly the product can be designed. Unfortunately, it's also going to impact the life cycle. The duration of the product is also very low because every step of the life cycle is getting shortened. The interaction becomes more intense and much closer, and the requirements keep shifting. So what is often talked about the economy in the world, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, is also something which impacts retail as a consequence. And demographics and reach. So it's no longer enough to talk about consumers or their economic levels, but also the demography becomes another important way of slicing and dicing the entire clientele. Now, if you look at the concept of the customer and how that is drastically changing, first and foremost, I think all of us at some level, no matter how well entrenched we are into all of this, see this whole explosion of data. It's coming from all directions, from all channels. And the question is, how do you make sense out of all this? And even more worrisome is, are my competitors doing something which I am not doing, and is there something that I need to know without which I will be muscled out of the market? And then on the social media, because a lot of the younger generation especially are communicating all the time, to not be there is to not be a part of the conversation, and to not be a part of the conversation is to not be effective in the market. And then the plethora of channels. You have the mobile, you have the net, you have television, you have cable, you have DTH, you have all these different channels, you have IPTV, and therefore all of these channels are in some way a part of this whole dynamic. And it's quite irritating and confusing for a consumer if you get very different responses, or if you are actually not seeing an integrated response. And finally, profiling is a very bad word, but in a commercial world, a profiling of a customer is a critical factor and a critical element in being able to actually get it right, and if done appropriately, is actually appreciated by a customer. So when people say, I don't want profiling, they only mean I don't want profiling of the type that I don't want. But when it is of the type that I want, that is extraordinarily useful. So if you take specific examples of companies that are using these technologies in appropriate ways, Clark's and the shoe prototyping, this is a segment where the design and the time to market and the prototyping, design and manufacture can be measured. And what we see is that the time it used to take to develop a prototype earlier is actually the time that today it takes to actually get the manufacturing done. And the time to design and develop is actually been shortened to just a few weeks. In fact, the time to design and develop is being done in just a few hours, and the prototyping is done in just a few hours as against 2 to 3 weeks which it was taking in the past. So more and more models of higher quality are coming out in a shorter time, and that makes the customer also confused because there are so many different models and so many different varieties, and therefore their use of technology to navigate through all of this information becomes more common, and in turn the presence on these media becomes more important. The examples of Volvo enabling delivery through their cars is another example of facilitation. Maybe that won't work so well in India. It's a good example in a developed economy, but in India, where we are accustomed to having things delivered at our doorstep and it's taken nowadays for granted, it may have a very different, it may play out very differently. So I think it's up to each one to look at these examples and then figure out, does it make sense in India? Does it not make sense? Would this work or not? Personal shopping from Topman, or the digital experience of RFID tags and how they are being used to project product features. And in fact, 10% of all the orders in flagship stores are now being placed using iPads. Another few instances of how technology has been enabling retailers to retain their competitive edge and stay relevant in their consumer base. For example, the augmented reality and virtual reality experience, which all those of you who are fans of Jurassic World and the whole spate of virtual reality kind of movies which have been coming would recognize the immense power and the lifelike reality which they create, and how it is applied in different areas. This is just one example of John Lewis using it in for giving customers a feel for the product before they actually make a purchase. Amazon and DHL using the delivery mode. Drones have now become commonplace in a world where driverless cars are making their advent. So I would, of course, many of us may not relish the idea of traffic jams in Bombay's airspace as drones compete to deliver products all across the city. And I'm not sure how the Six Sigma Dabbawalas would feel if a lot of these drones came in to do that. So the dynamic will be different. The recurring theme that I do want to say is that dynamic may be different, but it's up to all of us and all of you to really figure out how it will work. And again, automation technology. The supply chain is something which has altered most dramatically, and enhanced productivity, reduced inventory costs, reduced the cost of doing business, and therefore has become essential to optimizing the operations. If you look at the CIOs of a lot of the companies and what is keeping them awake, what are they focused on as they grapple with enabling their companies to make best use of these technologies? The social media, mobility, analytics, cloud, all of these disruptive technologies and how to use them how to link them to sales and marketing, how to link them to customer services, how to